So this is a Downrigger ball. They're made for fishing in deep water, like Lake Superior. This is 12 pounds, and it's very expensive, but I think I can make one of these. So let's give it a shot. Now to make the Downrigger balls, I'm gonna try a different type of casting, one that I've never tried before, lost foam casting. That's where you make the model in foam, bury it in sand, and because the foam is like 90% air.
90%.
Did you just make that up?
As soon as the metal hits it, it just dissolves instantly from the heat. The metal fills the void and you're left with whatever shape the foam was. It's kind of like lost wax casting, but instant. I mean, look how fast this foam disappears. Now the size of the Downrigger balls is kind of confusing to me because I'm going to be using brass, which is a different weight than iron, but I'm going to keep it roughly the same size. I'm thinking 2 pieces of foam will be thick enough for it. So I'm going to try to glue these together, but I can't use hot glue because that'll melt it. And other glues tend to eat foam, so I'm just going to use Elmer's glue. I mean, kids eat that stuff, so it's probably not going to dissolve foam, right? Now Elmer's glue is water-based, which means it dries instead of cures. I'm just hoping it's able to dry enough in this to hold it together. I'll need a very particular and well thought out weighing system to hold this foam together. Or maybe a bottle jack would work. Well, that's all for today. See you tomorrow. And just like that, my foam is glued together. So now we start carving it. I don't have an exact template, so I'm just going to freehand a fish-shaped ball and go with that. There's definitely a trick to carving this foam. It either carves or makes a mess. So right off the bat, I'm finding a key is to have a very sharp knife. You have to slice the foam, because if you push the foam, it tears and becomes a big mess like that. So sharp knife and slice. So it's somewhat taking ball shape, but I'm gonna just start freestyling it with my handy dandy belt sander. I'm sure this will have to be fairly symmetrical as it carves through the water, but I'm gonna eyeball it. You can get pretty close by eyeballing it. Oh. So it's taken on a little bit more of a fish shape and a more of a bell shape. I really don't know how well this is going to drift through the water. I'm hoping that I can keep it even enough so it doesn't pull itself one way or the other. But it's so heavy, I don't think it's really going to do much of that anyway.
You sure about that?
What I'm going to do now is I'm going to just take some hand sandpaper, and hand sand it. Oh. The glue in the middle isn't set. It started to shift. See that? Dang it.
Language.
Okay. Well, I'm done for the day. The inner glue needs to dry, so we'll leave that sit until that's dry and come back to it.
Microplastics are everywhere.
Probably not good to breathe in. That's solid again. Okay, so that's kind of fish-shaped and kind of streamlined. One thing I'm worried about is there's a couple holes right in the face there, and then one in the tail. Now, if I leave those there, when I pack the sand in there, that's going to go inside, and that's going to be a permanent divot in the middle. I don't want that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a thin piece, glue it on there, and then hopefully that'll seal up the hole so no sand gets in there. It's just a quick patch job. So the Downrigger ball is going to need anchors, so for that I got some stainless steel screw eyes here. And I picked stainless steel because galvanized burns off, and I just feel like stainless is going to be the least reactive when I pour the bronze in there. It has a little nut on there, and I'm going to try to embed that into the foam, because then when that becomes metal, there's no way that's going to pull out. And whereabouts do I put it though? We're about here. The nut isn't exactly going to screw into the foam, so what I think I need to do is use a drill bit to make a hole big enough to put the bolt and nut inside and then cork the top when I'm done. It's pretty good. That'll probably keep the sand out. Then they typically put one on the back side too, so let's put one there. So now when I test this out, it's not balanced at all. I realize that this is a lot heavier than the foam, and when it's all metal, it's gonna be a little bit more even, but gosh, I might just need to, hang on. I'm gonna remove this and just see how it balances without that. All right, that's gone, little better, but I think I'm gonna have to move this back just so it's more evenly balanced. Because when that's going through the water, I mean, maybe it will be fine. It's really hard to know, I don't know. I'm gonna move it back just a bit. Okay, I moved it back just a hair. It looks like it's gonna balance a lot better. I gotta fill that hole. Yeah, when I add that, man, that makes a big difference. But once this is all metal, I think that's gonna be insignificant and it's gonna balance a little bit better. How heavy is this gonna be when it's all brass? I have no idea. I'm gonna guess about 10 pounds. That's a total guess. Now, one way I might be able to calculate that would be to get a bucket of water and measure how much water this displaces and then add brass pieces until it displaces the same amount of water and then weigh it. But I'm not gonna do that. I'm just gonna wing it. So the biggest issue with something shaped like this is going to be controlling the metal shrinkage. Anytime you have a big blob of metal like that, it's going to shrink significantly. So I have a piece of foam attached here, and that's going to act as a big riser. So hopefully this will all cool, contract, and this will remain molten, full of molten metal. So as this is cooling and contracting, it'll have a reservoir to draw from. That's the theory. Don't know if it'll work. It is wider. What I don't want to have happen is have this cool while this is still molten, because then it's gonna try to rip itself apart as it contracts. It's gonna be a mess. But heat rises, so this should remain molten before this cools down. And if I'm worried about it, I can take a torch and add that to the top part. That'll keep that section hotter and liquid while this has time to cool and contract. I'm going to use what I have on hand, which is regular Petrobond sand. There'll be some specific considerations I have to keep in mind while using this type of sand, but I'll go over that in a bit. Now I'm putting a sand base down, and I'm going to set it on top of there and embed those screw eyes to it. That'll hold them in place, because when that foam melts all away, it's not going to hold those screws in place at all. The sand has to hold the screws. Then the metal goes around it, and then when it cools, it'll be solid. I don't want to compress this too hard because I don't want to miss shape in the foam. Although this foam is pretty sturdy, I can compact it a bit. It'll hold the shape. Now, I've never done lost foam casting before, but I know when the metal hits it, it's going to produce a lot of gas. And typically people will compact it with a loose, dry sand, so the gases have a lot of airspace to escape. I don't have loose packed sand there. I have Petrobond, just like any casting. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take a welding rod and poke all kinds of holes into that sand so it has lots of vent areas for the gases to escape. a little bit higher than I want it to be. So I'm just gonna do some pre-melting. Oh, it's too hot. It's still going. Stop! Clearly the foam wants to be molten. Now for this melt, I'm going to use scrap brass fittings. Brass can be a great casting metal, but when you're dealing with brass, there's like little O-rings that you got to be aware of. They can burn off, but they're going to be toxic if you breathe it, so you don't want to stand downwind. And brass fittings can have a lot of steel components inside. That's okay because steel is a lot less dense than the copper base of brass. So that'll float on top and you can just scrape it off. It can dissolve a little bit and cause a little bit of contamination, but for something like this, I'm really not that concerned about it. The main reason why I don't cast with brass all that much is because if you overheat it, it creates this white smoke. That's the zinc burning off. And if you breathe that in, you can get metal fume fever. And another thing is you cannot weld brass because of that zinc. And a lot of times I like to weld little flaws and fill things in, whatnot. But with brass, if you try to weld it, it immediately vaporizes that zinc. Bubbles and spurts, and you just don't get good welds. But with this piece, if I can avoid the metal shrinkage, I shouldn't need to weld anything. It's not even fully melted in there, but you can still see that there's white smoke, so zinc is burning off. As soon as that's melted, I'm gonna skim it and pour it. I don't want it to sit there long at all. This could go really well or it could explode, I have no idea. So I put on my leathers to make sure nothing splats on me. Jeez, what a mess. There was so much black smoke pouring over that I couldn't even see where the metal was going. Had enough metal to fill all the way to the top, but you know, look how much it contracted. How deep does that go? Now that could be a good sign. It's a sign that that was liquid as it was cooling and it drew all that metal in. But was it enough? That thing's gonna take a while to cool, so I'm just gonna leave it. I think I inhaled some fumes too, so I'm gonna go drink some water and lay down. Couldn't find my respirator. Oh, shoot. This has been sitting here for quite a while. It's still really hot. I was gonna put it on this board so the sand wouldn't get everywhere, but the metal's so heavy it just broke through the sand. I'm gonna take this out and see what we got. Oh. There's a giant hole going in it though. This eye got filled in, so potentially I didn't pack enough sand in there when I put it in the ground. That's very possible. On the top side here, you can see it's full of inclusions, so that's probably all the soot and stuff from the molten foam. And this riser didn't end up being nearly as high as I'd like it to be. And look how deep that sucked in there. So there's a big hole in that fish. But let's cut this off. I'm gonna grind some of this away and see if I can polish it up a bit, and we'll see what we get. Huge hole. The sand wasn't completely smooth around the foam, which left a lot of voids, and that was filled in by the metal, creating these flaws. I'll do my best to cut those off and then start working on the polish. So I spent just a little bit of time with the grinder on there. It's got a little bit more of a shine, but still here where all these inclusions were, I'm not going to be able to grind those out. Now if this was bronze, I could take my welder, but like I said, brass, you can't weld because that zinc burns off. I mean, you can, but it's just a mess. A lot of these Downrigger balls are painted black anyway, so I could paint it black, but on this one, I kind of want it to be like a flasher. I want it to shine and kind of maybe attract the fish. So I think I'm going to keep going and get a higher polish on there. So when I was casting it, that eye got full of metal, so I need to re-drill that out. That's a pretty straightforward process, as long as I can keep the drill bit straight. As for the hole in the bottom, my wife said, well, why don't you just fill it full of metal? So we're going to give that a try. Gosh, there's still a hole in there. It was full of metal. I don't understand how there was that much. That's just weird. Let's try to pry this off. The spillage doesn't really stick to the metal. It's just a matter of getting it pried off. Well, this piece just broke off. I'm going to hammer that in there, peen it over, and that should plug that hole. This is basically how ancient people would have filled holes like this before the invention of welders. Peening makes the metal harder, but also more brittle, so it's a little easier to snap it off. And then a little trip to the grinder and it's nice and smooth. Little polishing wheel set and that'll give a much higher shine. So the hole in the belly is patched fairly well. It's not perfect, but the whole thing isn't perfect. Then I put a shine over the surface. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a ball peen hammer and peen in some texture. Now the reason why I wanted to have a shine over there before I do that is because when you peen things, if there's scratches and stuff from the grinder or sandpaper, they don't disappear with the peen. You just get dented scratches and then they're impossible to remove. So you have to get it nice and shiny first, then you can peen it, and then the peen will be fairly shiny as well. And with that, we're done. Now, it's definitely not my cleanest casting. There's still a lot of inclusions and a lot of gunk from the foam. So, lost foam casting, I don't know that I'm the biggest fan. My first attempt at it, it worked fairly well, but I don't think I'm going to switch to it. The only thing left to do is go catch some fish. So update, the thing doesn't work. When you put it in the water, the design of it is kicking it off to the side and the tail is not big enough to straighten it out. So I'm thinking it would have been better off if I had the tip less pointy and had a bigger tail on the back. That would keep it planing straight and true. Now I could weld a tail on the back and that would kick it straight, I'm sure. But brass is hard to weld, so keep that in mind if you make your own. You can see on the store-bought ones, they typically have a blunter nose and a more prominent tail to plane it straight. Live and learn. Anyway, there you go. Thanks for watching.